All right, thank you for that extremely brief introduction. We are going to try to make this as interactive as possible. Use the Slido code and pose questions. I have a monitor. I'll try to accommodate as many as I can, but please send them in. I'm going to introduce the panelists in a second, but when Zhang Ruimin speaks, he'll be speaking in Chinese with simultaneous translation, so please have your headsets ready if you're not a Chinese speaker. So this panel is called Networks and Platforms, the New Means of Value Creation. We're spending a couple of days talking about ecosystems. I think ecosystems is one of those terms that has been talked about for so long, it's hard to figure out exactly where we are in its evolution. The Muse online news platform actually put it #1 in its list of annoying buzzwords a long time ago. But it seems like we are at a moment where this familiar term is coming of age. I often ask executives of their perception of risk on the horizon. And I recently spoke to Zhang Ruimin, CEO of Haier, who's on my far left. And he said something that maybe can help frame our discussion. The biggest risk for companies now is to focus on their product. Meaning, if they're not thinking about iteration, if they're not thinking about a broader ecosystem of customer experience, they're going to be left behind. So that's kind of what we mean here by ecosystems. Multi-company systems that bring together partners, animated by a belief that collaboration is needed for innovation, is needed for business. So let me introduce my panel then. To my immediate left is Vinton Cerf, who is Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google. To his left is Michael Jacobides, who is a professor at London Business School and who's written several pieces about ecosystems, including for Harvard Business Review. To his left is Miriam Meckel, who is the founding publisher of Ada, which is a digital platform that's part of the Handelsblatt media group. To her left is Amy Webb, who is the founder of the Future Today Institute and a professor at the Stern School in New York City. And to my far left, Zhang Ruimin, who is CEO and chairman of the board of Haier, one of the a Qingdao-based Chinese company that's truly one of the most innovative companies out there. So let's get started. And Mike, I'm going to ask you, I guess maybe as a scene setter, if you could, why are we talking about ecosystems now? What has changed exactly, and what is this group? How should this group think about ecosystems right now, 2019?
Well, two things. Let me start with the second part of your question, which is how should we think about it? And I think that there's two different ways that you can think about the ecosystems. One of them, you can think about them as poetry. I'm kind of made to think about Monsieur Jourdain in Molière's Bourgeois Gentilhomme. It's this guy who gets this nice polish, and he's got a teacher for poetry and a teacher for prose, and then he says, oh my God, I've been speaking prose all my life. So similarly with ecosystems, someone says, but I've had an ecosystem throughout, it's wonderful. And yes, it's useful to think about it metaphorically, and Alex's introduction to me is the beauty of the metaphor of ecosystems. That's one thing, and I don't want to diminish it. It's cool. There's another thing, and that's, I think, the reason that we really are speaking about ecosystems, and that's a little bit of what creates the confusion, because you can think about all that nice stuff, but what you see today is that you see groups of firms, one of their executives sitting in my right, that are creating dense web of relationships and that are operating across their own boundaries, and whose power rests on structured sets of collaborations where these groups of companies compete between each other. So Google has a number of different ecosystems, including in the mobile phone industry. Alphabet, I should say, has bought, it wasn't its to begin with, Android, and Android is something that it controls. Why? Well, because it wants to ensure that all the phones carry the search engine that carry the ad revenues for itself. So in order for Google to make money, it needs to ensure that the mobile phone technology goes a particular way. So it has this ecosystem of things that work with each other. So these are ecosystems not as metaphors, but as actual business things. Now, why do we see them now today? Why they're all over the place? I think that it's primarily because we have seen waves of deregulation as well as of technology, which means that we are not focused one market, one product at a time. We are much freer than we were in the past to combine them in ways that deliver value to the customer. That essentially means as a big soup, you can mix them together, and then creative companies come and then say, look, I'm going to give you this great package. So you see this growth of ecosystems, and we see them every day. And we do things that a few years ago would be unthinkable. One of the challenges that Ruimin has is that our fridge can order the milk. And the question is, who's going to be made doing the milk ordering? There's money in who makes the milk ordering. There's money in the way that you organize it. So I think that technology allows us to revisit how we add value. And that essentially means that you can reorganize stuff, and that's where ecosystems emerge, and that's why they have become a thing that I think we need to think about, not just as a cute metaphor, but as an actual tool that can deliver business value.
Yeah. Well, since you mentioned Google, maybe I'll turn to Vinton now. Google is moving into more and more of these verticals. And it's controlling a lot of activity, and it's, I guess I'm interested inside the company. How are you thinking about ecosystems? What is the ecosystem strategy, such as it is?
Well, first of all, if you don't mind, I just want to say something about the first panel. The focus of attention on people is vitally important. I was so taken by all of the things they said. I'm an engineer, and I think about ecosystems kind of like Legos. The standardization is what makes it possible to interconnect things that weren't otherwise interconnected. It means that we can work together with other companies. We supply part of the platform, they supply other parts that specialize things, or in our vertical systems. In many cases, we build ourselves on top of those commonalities, those platforms. This is probably the most powerful thing that drives the company, is trying to make things work not only within the space that we are responsible for and manage, for example, the cloud, but also to make sure that when people come to use those technologies, they can interwork with them successfully. They can make and add value to them. So from my point of view, the most important thing about ecosystems is their stability, their interoperability, and their ability to adapt to change and to accept change. So think about Legos for just a moment and all the new models that come out. Everything still fits together, even though there are specialized pieces that show up here and there. So the company is, in the interior, is extremely concerned about making that ecosystem work well. We've restructured ourselves more than once. Most recently, we created a core group which is focused on making that ecosystem function technically and uniformly.
Yep. Okay. Miriam, I guess you have Ada. It is a platform, I suppose, not an ecosystem per se. But when you look at what's happening, do you think the current platform model, as we know it, will survive, or does it feel like it needs to morph into something else?
Well, I think you could look at the answer to this question from two perspectives. The first one is whether we will have a development where the big platforms grow and grow, and we enter an age of gargantuan wells of data, where this process of elaborating on the network effect and having the platforms grow will go on. So that will be probably a process of more and more monopolization, which might lead from a political point of view to a consequence where we have something like a bifurcated internet, a Western internet, or how you want to call it, and a Chinese internet. And if you look at what we see, for example, in terms of the development of the credit scoring system that is coming up in China at the moment, that's basically one of the models where we see how an integration of platform might go on in a way that we can't even imagine today. That's one perspective we have to take into account and consider as a future option for the development of platforms. The other one is what we are talking about right now in terms of breaking up big tech. If we listen to Elizabeth Warren and other people thinking about whether this model might not be the one we really are into for our future perspective, and then something like more of a competition model of different platforms coming up might be thinkable, and I think that could be also a very, very interesting way of thinking how platforms can develop. And I would, of course, hope for this kind of competition, because I think it's really something we need. Whether the platforms develop in one or the other way will basically influence how we live in the future, because everything we do is somehow based on platforms. And so whether it might be more competition kind of thing or more a monopolization kind of thing is very much influencing our lives in each and every perspective we can imagine. And then I would like to mention another issue, which basically relates to what some of the panelists from the first panel have said, whether we look at, or how we look at, the value creation on these platforms. So let me give you two examples. If you think of Wikipedia, which is a non-profit platform, of course, but basically Wikipedia has managed to offer the world an insight into the knowledge of the world, having a lot of problems. They face bias, they face certain issues, but still that's basically value creation in terms of really providing additional value to people in their social lives, not just from an economic perspective. And I'm not talking about non-profits or something like that here. I'm talking about whether you just focus on profit and growth and scalability like other platforms do, for example, Facebook. And I think these two models of value creation will be figured out in the next years, related to the first question of monopolization versus competition, and that will be basically deciding upon how our future with platforms will look like.
So
Could I react?
No, I'm going to let you speak. I want to actually set the stage for you to speak.
Thank you.
So Vint wants to jump in, as you can see, but I encourage that. I would like the model of this to be more like family style, like food fight, rather than just sort of one by one. So Vint, jump in.
Okay, so thank you very much. That's wonderful. Look, there's a third way, and that third way has to do with collaboration and cooperation. So remember, before the internet, there were a bunch of networks that didn't work together. Then the internet came along and said, hey, you can glue them all together, so everybody takes advantage of that. This is happening in the cloud space now, too. There are these things called Kubernetes or containers, which allow you to write software that runs on multiple clouds. There's more attention being paid to allowing clouds to interact with each other. So there is a path here that allows collaboration and cooperation while we're competing with each other. And that helps everybody, because now you don't feel trapped in some particular piece of an ecosystem. So I really think that we're seeing an opportunity here to avoid the harmful side effects of those two extremes that you mentioned.
Okay, great. So I want to turn to Zhang Ruimin now. For those who don't know, he is the chairman and CEO of Haier, which is, I think, the world's largest maker of large appliances. It bought out GE's refrigerator, big appliance business. Wow. And the business model at Haier is extremely flat. And so I really want to have him talk about, I think you've called Haier an ecosystem brand. So you're really embracing this concept as a strategic imperative. So please talk about what ecosystem, what that means to Haier and to your business strategy. And again, if you need translation, slip on the ear goggles.
I've had many conversations with you, Adi. And you've raised many questions about ecosystems. And I think ecosystems are extremely important for companies today. We all need to transform into ecosystems. Otherwise, we won't be able to survive. Take Haier as an example. Haier has been ranked as one of the largest white goods manufacturers in the world, and also a #1 brand for large appliances. But now we want to transform from this largest company in white goods to a major ecosystem. We've been making progress toward that goal for over a decade. In the future, I think single standalone products are no longer valuable. What's more valuable is a user case scenario where all of the appliances are connected together. What users want is a best user experience, which requires the connection of many different products. It's just like a human being. You can't really say you have a really nice shirt or nice pair of trousers. You would say that you look very good, and all of whatever you wear is very fitting. So this is a very personalized approach, from mass production to mass customization. We are building, for example, an internet of food, which connects ovens, microwaves, and stoves and refrigerators. All of these connected appliances can talk to food producers and cook and recipe providers, so that our users are not simply using the appliances, but accessing the best food ingredients and the best recipes. So it's no longer just about a product, but about a use case scenario. And we are also building an internet of clothing, so you no longer just have a washing machine in your home, but you also have access to detergent manufacturers, to clothing manufacturers, and we also add RFID chips to the clothing items, so that users are not just washing the clothes, but also getting more information about how to take care of their clothing items. And today, we have actually created international standards for Internet of Things for food and clothing. So I don't think there will be perfect products in the future. We'll only be progressing toward a better use case scenario. And I think there are going to be two trends in the future. Products are going to be replaced by use case scenarios. And secondly, ecosystems are going to overlap and cover different industries. As I said, products are not going to be any more value creating when they're just standalone, because all different industries are going to overlap. In the Internet of Clothing that we're building, we have now engaged P&G and Henkel, and they're very happy to be part of the ecosystem because they aren't really growing quickly in the Chinese market today. But now, as part of the ecosystem, they are able to grow 15%, so that we are no longer fighting alone, but fighting together for our users. We have also established our #1 experience store in Shanghai, using a completely new model, showcasing a smart home consisting of a smart kitchen, a smart sitting room, a smart balcony, so that customers are not just picking one single product, but an entire set of solutions. And the average purchasing value is not just a few $100s, but actually 60,000 US dollars. That's an average purchasing value. And this cannot be achieved by just a single product. And after users purchased these solutions, the different pieces of appliances have sensors attached to them, so that we can continuously interact with the user and develop the users into lifelong users. And we can continually iterate and create better experience for them. And that's, I think, a major trend into the future. And I think also companies need to become ecosystem companies. I think this is in line with the Internet of Things era. We have created what we call a 人单合一 model, which means aligning our employees with the needs of the users. And aligning the value created by employees with the value that can be shared among the employees and entrepreneurs. We have eliminated 12,000 jobs or middle-level managers and created thousands of micro-enterprises, each only 8 members or so, and they are able to talk directly with the user. We also built a Cosmoplat model, which is recognized by international standardization organizations. So working in various fields such as agriculture, construction, and enabling different industries to better customize for their users. Some of our micro-enterprises have gone public and become very successful by building an ecosystem. I don't think you can survive as a standalone company without an ecosystem into the future. I'm a big fan of Peter Drucker. I've read all of his books. I think one thing has always been inspiring me, one thing that he said, and that is companies in the 21st century, every one of us will become our own CEO in the 21st century.
Thank you, CEO Zhang. So that was a good and comprehensive answer. But Amy, I'll turn to you in a second. But I do, Miriam mentioned that one consequence of the ecosystem economy, platform economy, is that it could accelerate the divergence of technology, China and the rest of the world. And I don't want to just sort of skip past that, and I'm interested in your opinion. I think a lot of us feel that is a present danger, I guess, that China goes in one direction, the West goes in another, and that this could accelerate that. Do you agree with that? Do you see a risk in that?
I think there are different directions. First, traditional companies only have transactional customers. They only care about selling products. But ecosystems care about users, not transactional customers. In traditional selling model, sales is the end of the relationship. But in the new model, sales is the beginning of our relationship. And also, traditional companies are quite self-centered. They play a zero-sum game. They just want to be the loser. They want to be the winner, and they don't care about others lose. Whereas in the ecosystem, we work with all of the partners to create value for the user and share the value we create. And I think that's a big characteristic of the IoT, which is sharing economy.
Meckel and then Vin, yeah.
Just a quick point here. I think that the challenge here is twofold. First, there's nothing which is sort of God-given in terms of how technologies will work. And we are seeing now the result of the Trump administration's push in creating a bifurcation, certainly with a push against Huawei that is creating most probably a third pole in terms of the platform for mobile communications. Google was extremely happy to have Huawei, which was about to be the biggest handset manufacturer, work with them, and they have been lobbying like mad, the administration, saying, guys, you are undermining our potential dominance. Yeah. And long term, this is entirely destructive. Now, this is I don't want to go into the politics of it, but I do think that there are some choices that are being made and that are pushing technology in this way, and that I think are pushing Chinese companies, at least the ones that I interact with, to say, can't trust them, so we've got to be self-reliant. So unfortunately, the world is moving in this direction as a result, quite clearly, of the current administration not of the US overall. The second thing that is, I think, important to understand is that not all ecosystems are global. A few are, but many, actually most, aren't. So if you think about social media, they're global, operating systems, they're global, mobile phones, they can operate globally. But things like mobility, it's one city at a time. It's not even one country at a time. If you think about Uber, it needs to have the requisite mass in each individual city and country that it goes, which is why it was pushed out of markets like Singapore and why you see companies like Grab or Gojek be strong in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Singapore, and in other parts of the world. So we will see some local ecosystems where there is greater defensibility, but there are some big prizes that are global. And in these big prices, I think that we are going to see this bifurcation between the US and China, with Europe doing a very bizarre thing, because on the one hand it says, I'd like to do more regulation, and on the other hand, the new head of the Commission says, I'd like to have a big bazooka because I feel left out, because I don't have a Google or Facebook. And if you speak to people in the Commission, they are entirely schizophrenic because they hate big tech, but they'd like one of their own.
Wow. Okay, so I'm levitating out of my chair again. First of all, this is not going to work very well unless the engineers get together and say, you know what, we got to make all this stuff interwork, because I want multiple brands of equipment to interwork. When I bring something home, I expect that it's going to work with everything else. That's certainly our philosophy of IoT at Google, and I hope that that's shared by others, Mr. Zhang in particular. So that's very important. The second thing that's exciting about this concept is to go away from the transactional and to get into a service mode where you have a relationship with a user over a good long period of time. And the third thing is software. Okay, everybody should be scared now. Software, it's very scary. You know, it's a miracle when it works, and often it doesn't. But in any case, what's important is that you can adapt the products over time by changing the software. Sort of like Tesla, you know, I get up in the morning and my Tesla says, hi, guess what I can do today that I didn't do yesterday? And my first reaction is, can you still do the other stuff that you were doing yesterday so that I can rely on that? But this idea of malleability in this ecosystem of devices, I find extremely exciting. Last point, internet-enabled clothing. This is getting really great. Imagine that you can get up in the morning, pull out your mobile, and send a signal around to find the missing sock, which reports that it's under the sofa in the living room. You will have solved a major problem for humanity.
Great. Okay. So, Amy, I want to talk to you as our resident futurologist. You know, how do we think about this? How do companies prepare for a future where they may need to be in an ecosystem or not? I mean, how do we think about that? How do we make those decisions in an informed way?
Sure. So, you know, I think from a cognitive perspective, metaphors are useful because they allow us to take shortcuts. And our brains, these squishy computers inside of our heads, want to conserve energy. So metaphor is a useful way for us to think through very complicated concepts. The challenge is that we tend, as a result, to talk about things in layers of abstraction. And when we're not able to get specific and granular, and we're not having meaningful decisions, whether that's or conversations, whether that's in our boardrooms or in our places of work, or in our offices where laws are being discussed, the problem is that if we rely on metaphor too heavily, and if we don't get beyond those levels of abstraction that feel comfortable to us, we start making poor choices and we miss all of the signals that tell us something about the future in the present. And that is what I observe happening, whether we're talking about the IoT or the industrial Internet of Things, the IIoT, or finding a sock using our mobile, because the thing that underpins all of this is the next era of computing. The next era of computing is powered by data, which we are all creating a tremendous amount of, and also by artificial intelligence. The challenge with artificial intelligence is that we tend to talk about it as a metaphor too. artificial intelligence is not a thing, although it is the undercurrent of all of the things that all of the other panelists have been talking about. AI is an umbrella term. Here's another metaphor. Think of an umbrella. And there's all kinds of other things, that can fit underneath it. Or one of the early modern progenitors of AI, Marvin Minsky and John McCarthy, they used to talk about suitcases. And AI is kind of a suitcase term because it packs a bunch of other things inside of it. So the challenge is that there's a lot of misplaced optimism and fear when we talk about all of this. And a lot of our cues come from metaphors, particularly from places like science fiction, where we've got very clear ideas now about what a future might look like. And for the most part, that's robots coming to murder us in our sleep, or robots taking all of our jobs. AI is on a very long trajectory, and we're talking about over the next, probably 7 decades. And there have been some very interesting developments. So some of those developments have to do with the standardization that Vint mentioned, and that Zhang mentioned as well. The problem, of course, is who's making determinations about those norms and standards. So while there may be interoperability within Google's cloud does not, that I know of, interoperate well with AWS.
Yes, it does. That's the whole point of Kubernetes.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
Let me continue for just a moment, and then we can debate cloud interoperability. This kind of thing is really relevant to everybody in the room because a lot of our systems rely on data, and we don't have a lot of transparency and clarity around whose data, under what circumstances. My assumption is that most of your organizations at the very top levels are not talking about things like data governance, which is not fun to discuss, but certainly really important. And because we've had a leadership vacuum in the United States over the past few administrations, in the United States and in other areas around the world, we currently have a conflicting idea about what the future of data and AI and all of these systems would look like. And the issue tends to be discussed in relation to things like human rights, but there's a more practical piece of this as well. Just as an example, so we're talking about looking for socks in our homes using a mobile, which is cool. Amazon has entered the housing market in kind of a strange way. They've taken a investment position in a company called Lennar, which is one of America's largest home builders. You can now look for homes on Amazon.com, and these are smart homes that have more than just a few Bluetooth speakers. They do all kinds of different things. So this is all really interesting. Apple, Google, Microsoft, all of these big companies in the United States and other companies around the world have troves of data, and we don't have answers to questions like, what if some of these companies started trading on this proprietary data in a way that might cause a new kind of inflation that we've never seen before, a new kind of housing bubble or problem. So these are the kinds of things we should be talking about in much deeper detail. And the challenge, of course, as we're talking about ecosystems, is that there's not one ecosystem. And if we still believe that Darwin is right, then we've got two competing ecosystems, one that's being built by the United States in a free market economy, and one that's being built in China that has different structural and longer-term goals. It's unlikely that both ecosystems will have equal power and will benefit everybody equally over a longer period of time. So what I think we're witnessing in the present is a restructuring of the global economy. And that's probably something that we ought to be talking, again, in much more specific detail about. So, I think we're in an era of deep uncertainty. I would say that there's no way to predict the future because it's mathematically impossible, but we can at least try to address the deep uncertainty with deep questions. Because if we don't, we may be sorry later on. So.
All right, that's great. Meckel, you wanted to jump in?
I just wanted to build on that and try to separate a couple of different issues. One issue, and I think that's something that we all instinctively understand, and where we have fear of big technology for good reason, is that our behavior has changed, and the answer is partly here. Your day, my day, everyone's day is different because we consume the world with the intermediation of a device, The device used to be sort of important, and it was the PC. Now the center of gravity has changed, and it's a smartphone with a PC or tablet or anything else being essentially its satellites, its accessory. Now, why is this important, and why do we care about it? Well, partly 2 years ago, if you think about the two quotes, I searched Google the day the Nobel Prize in Economics was announced. Really nice guy, an interesting fellow who won it, Dick Thaler. Dick Thaler said two things. The first thing says that humans essentially are lazy, and as such, the default choice gets a disproportionate part of the market. Okay. The second thing that he said is that firms, that Google said that he said, is that firms are choice architects. You put these two together and you put your firm together, you understand what the challenge is. We have the possibility of some firms that are our intermediaries to the world that are the bottlenecks, and they also charge tolls. Apple charges 30%. Google charges differently, so it doesn't like to charge a high percentage, but it makes its money by the ads of people clicking through. So there is a concern about our dependence and who drives the conduit. This is why you see a competition between Amazon, that you mentioned a moment ago, and Google, and now Uber is trying the same thing, primarily because I think the model that they have is going to lead them to ruin if they continue this way, which is my second point. So you have this problem, we need to address this problem, we need to think about it, because you see, the regulation does not think about it in clever ways. Regulation looks at what they call SNP, small but non-transit increases in prices in well-defined markets. That's the only thing that you have. The control is not now driven by one market at a time. As Ruimin was saying, it's driven by managing your connections to the rest of the world. What does that mean? We need to update the way that we think about it. And we haven't done that yet. And it's interesting, I was in Moscow 2 months ago in the BRICS competition meeting, and it's interesting that it is the BRICS competition authority that is starting to think, how should we reformulate competition policy for that? So that's one big issue. Power, control, what happens not only with Google, I'm not going to give advice to Google, but we've got millions of people that are working under its ecosystems. We need to care about them, partners, not just the orchestrators, because that's how you embed in ecosystems. The second thing which is separate is, do all ecosystems look like these big 6, 5, 7, 10, 14, small number, whichever way you count it? And the answer is no. There are a few ecosystems where the orchestrators are unusually strong. Why? Well, because they are atypical, because they have network externalities. Not all ecosystems have network externalities. Not all orchestrators are going to be as strong. So I think that the second thing that we need to understand is what works and what doesn't, and which are the right analogies and which are the wrong analogies. For people thinking about ecosystems, we are over-reliant on Facebook and Google and Apple. They do not characterize your average ecosystem structure in industrial settings.
Yeah.
Maybe I can relate to that and try to bring back the discussion a bit to the question of value creation, because Amy said we can't predict the future, which is probably true, but still let's take a look what these platforms or these ecosystems deliver to the people. So if Wind goes hunting for one of his socks using his mobile phone in the morning, that's basically about convenience.
Yes.
So it's very convenient to do that because you don't need to remember where you put it, and you don't even need to take a fresh one because you can still go hunting for the old one, the used one. But that's all about convenience.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if I understand the CEO of Higher Right, then he says we are not talking about products, but we're talking about purchasing solutions. And that's also about convenience. And what I'm thinking about is whether this might open up the perspective that we are entering a world of an overall solution. It's not about the Internet of Things, but it's about the Internet of everything. Everything will be delivered as a solution that is very convenient. And from an individual perspective, from a human perspective, I have to say, I would rather like to stick to some of my problems, because if I only face solutions from each and every day, from morning to night, I can't grow with my problems. And that's one of the perspectives where I really think we need to discuss whether we want that, whether we want the world to be an overall delivery system of solutions where people will, based on AI, get everything they need from a point of convenience, which is a basic trade-off related to privacy, related to competition, related to a lot of things that might be very, very helpful for human beings to grow, to interact in a way that is necessary to keep up something we call society, social life, all those kinds of things, debates. That's not about convenience, but it's about inconvenience, creating new perspectives, making us or empowering us to grow in searching for solutions ourselves. And that is something that really worries me a bit in regard of the Internet of Everything. That is a great concept from a business perspective, but it might not be that such a great concept from a perspective of social life, of humans living together and trying to be sustainable in their approach to life.
Yes.
But we have to be practical. So I think we ought to be practical here. In the United States, you hear a lot of people talking about demonizing big tech and how upset they are at Facebook and upset they are at Apple and Google and name a bunch of companies. Everybody's very upset. And we don't see usage patterns changing at the same rate as everybody's complaints about technology. So we can make decisions that we should live with more inconvenience, but there's a practical aspect, which is once a technology becomes so convenient and it's such an invisible part of your everyday life, whether that's at home or at work, we don't even think about that technology before. We don't investigate or indulge our curiosities about how that technology works. And we are unwilling to give up the convenience of having it. We've already crossed that threshold. So we ought to think about the next order implications and what we can do. And what we can do is ask, who's in charge of all of this data? What rights should everyday people have in making determinations about who has access to that data? And who are the people that are making the decisions about the data? Because we are currently in an era of algorithmic determinism, which is another way of saying we have much less choice, even though we appear to have so many more options in this modern era of computing. And what we've spent a lot of time talking so far about Google and Amazon and Apple, let's not forget that Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent are three incredibly important Chinese companies that are also building out the frontiers and future of all of the systems that we're going to be using.
Sorry, but before we go to Google, I want to jump in because we will focus on Google.
You will definitely get the last word here.
We will get to Google, and I want to make sure that we don't focus only at big tech. So, two things. Let me give a slightly more optimistic note. Think about what are the big problems that we're facing today. Pollution, or let me get even more simple, congestion, mobility. Now, think about the ways that we're resolving and what are some of the new ecosystems that are emerging. I'll give you two examples, one hyper-small, one that has grown a fair bit. Hyper-small, small venture called Velocia that is working with the city of Miami-Dade to say, well, we need to do a couple of things like carpooling and using parts of our public transport system better in order to reduce traffic on the road and in order to ensure that we have less pollution. So what are they doing? Well, they have linked the public sector, the city and other agencies, the transport people, Uber and other providers, and they are providing tokens so that when you carpool, you get a token. When you do other things that you like, you get a token. And people are rewarded, and you start seeing behavior which isn't only the one that's familiar in the United States with the carpool-only lanes, but that you have a slightly more dynamically updated and environmentally conscious conscious way of getting things organized. Or think about WIM, MAAS, a venture that started in Finland and has grown now quite a bit, that is trying to manage the mobility needs, again connecting different types of participants. The effort that happened, Ms. Bender, when she was a transport minister in Finland, and that created some shockwaves in Finland, because she says, well, why do we have in cold areas in Lapland empty buses going in the evening when there's no passengers? It's not good for the environment, it's not good for people. Well, I'll tell you why, because there was no other way of figuring out how to meet demand and supply. Now we have phones, and essentially they pushed for changing the system from empty public buses to mobility as a service and on demand, and when you need it, in order to support both what the needs of the individual riders are and to reduce the impact on the environment. So we can think about the downsides and also only the big companies as ecosystems, but we can also think about what we can do to help improve the systemic problems we have. Issues around pollution, issues around the environment, issues around mobility that affect our daily lives, when we are thinking about how we can orchestrate structures of systems where we design them in order to collectively solve them, and which do not need to be and are not only part of the big firms. So, of course, we'll go to Google, but I think that there's more to ecosystems than that.
Mr. Cerf.
Well, thank you. First of all, I want to remind you of something that Alan Kay said, which is very helpful. He said, if you want to predict the future, the best way to do that is invent it. And so I'm speaking now for the engineers who would like to help invent the future. The second thing is that I don't think that we need to be trapped in somebody else's solution. One of the things that I find compelling, and this is another metaphor, Amy, think about spreadsheets for a moment. That's basically a platform, but who makes the spreadsheets? We make the spreadsheets. We learn how to use that tool in order to make it do something that we need it to do, not that somebody else did. So the idea that we can use a lot of these technologies to solve our own problems is pretty exciting. Artificial intelligence, and I agree with Amy's note that this is some of it's silly science fiction. But machine learning is turning out to have some fairly powerful, useful effects. It also is brittle in many ways, so we have to pay attention to that. But it's an enabling technology. So think about speech understanding and voice recognition. People are interacting with a lot of systems today by speaking to them instead of by typing or touching on the screen. So Google Assistant and Alexa and the like are tools that we can reach through this voice interaction, and we can get them to do things for us. But they're not just doing standard things. I mean, it's just like Google search. I mean, 15% of all the searches that we receive, we've never seen before. And so there's this avenue to exploring the technology, using the technology for solving our own problems. We don't have to wait for somebody else to solve them. And the last point, the thing I found so interesting about what you were saying, Michael, it sounds like you were getting tokens for good behavior. And that's a kind of money in a way.
That's kind of what, sorry?
It's a kind of money, tokens for good behavior. Sure. So that's an interesting way of encouraging people to do what we might call the right thing.
And the tokens there are used for getting you rides on public transport. So it's also a way of starting to shift behavior in order to do things that are going to be better for the environment and also for congestion in the city. And I think that there is entrepreneurship now in the way that these ecosystems are structured, but what we need to think of is what are the rules that we have and the governance and organization of ecosystems, and where exactly interoperability is. And I'm not going to go in between you as you disagree what are the details of the different cloud services, but I do think it's a very important issue and one that we need to address on what are the regulatory structures that we have for that, and also how do we encourage ecosystems that are starting to address, and again, our world is facing a crisis that in some countries is not as evident, and we have systemic issues, and the environment is the most important systemic issue. In order to address it, I think that we need to think creatively about how to harness collective engagement, whether it's rewarding the right behavior one way or the other.
So here's a big thought. Suppose that we redesign cities to be more environmentally friendly. I mean, think about Singapore for a moment and imagine, there's this wonderful Tony Tan's here somewhere. They got this single city and they have the opportunity to literally let it redefine itself. It's the right size to let you do that. So imagine going away from the 1950s. Remember when we did the Interstate Highway Act? What happened was that it boomed. It was a housing boom and an automobile boom, and a giant economic increase. But it probably also introduced a massive amount of pollution. Maybe we should be thinking big and thinking, well, maybe it's time to re-engineer our cities to be much more environmentally friendly. Boy, wouldn't that be a big economic explosion?
But all of these things would require short-term sacrifice in the name of longer-term growth, which really means very long-term planning. Singapore does long-term planning. Any of the other things that we've been talking about run counter. There's a tension between needing to make your quarterly earnings report and thinking about the next order, potentially negative downstream implications of the decisions that you're making. There is such a thing as a planned biological ecosystem where you engineer the flora and the fauna and the air and the animals and everything else, thinking about growth over a very long period of time. The alternate to that is an organically growing ecosystem. And as that proceeds, there's more uncertainty, there's less that you can predict. What I see happening is, while we love to talk about ecosystems, we've opted for the second version, organically growing it without doing any of the necessary long-term planning. And then, when we don't like the way that that ecosystem has grown and flourished, we try to regulate after the fact. Regulating after the fact causes additional tension, and it winds up doing the absolute opposite of what Vint has been encouraging all of us to do, which is to collaborate. So the only possible way forward, if we're going to have the rise of all of these ecosystems and derive the value that Miriam talked about, is to plan things out to the extent that we can in advance. Being very strong on the vision of what that looks like, reverse engineering it back to the present day, and being flexible in our implementation of strategy. But that is not the way that most modern organizations are willing to operate. So this is a leadership change if we want any of these things to look better in the future.
And it's a systemic question, I guess, because long-term planning and short-term sacrifices might go much better with systems which are less democratic. That's a thesis I would put out to discuss. Because if you can decide as a government, or if it's just possible to say, we want to implement this technology, we want to go in this direction, we want to do this in step 1, step 2, step 3, and people just have to adapt to that. Like it's possible in Singapore, like it's possible in China. That's a totally different model than we know from the western part of the world and other parts of the world, where people have a say in what's going to happen. And if you try to figure out what that might mean in terms of, for example, applying facial recognition technologies, other technologies, in a whole ecosystem as a society, let's put it that way, then we will observe, that's a thesis at least I can think we could discuss, we will observe that less democratic systems will be much quicker in implementing new technologies. They will be much quicker in enabling change, might even be in terms of ecological sustainability and other issues than democracies are. And that means we might be facing, in terms of political systems, an export of less democratic systems, because they're just better in the position to enable changes, because they don't have to deal with people intervening all the time.
Counterpoint.
That's a provocative.
Quick
I
counterpoint,
don't hope that this will happen.
I want to shift, but quick counterpoint.
Okay, just the counterpart. I think the future is in the hands of the mayors of the cities, because that's where all the action is.
I don't know if this gives me hope, actually.
I thought you were
So
democracy.
I want to shift this a little bit and get a little bit more sort of practical. A lot of the questions that are coming in are really about, how do I do this? How do we operationalize this? So maybe I'll throw out a general question. Michael, you're nodding the most, so maybe you could start. But one of the questions is, how do we deal with some of what feels like the inherent barriers to this type of collaboration, and even thinking about incentives within companies.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that don't immediately seem to reward people for this kind of development. So I think there are two questions. There's that, and then also, what are the skills and competencies that we are looking for to build these kinds of businesses?
So let me dial it back, not on the societal, but on the business issues. So I would say there are two types of issues that I see. The first one is the choosing what you want to be. And I think that, speaking about the analogies, people think about ecosystems. Ecosystems have orchestrators. You usually think about the big tech firms, and you're like, oh, I would like to then be the Facebook or Google of my sector, which is, and I should do exactly what they do, which is kind of like saying, oh, look, LeBron James plays good basketball, I need to shoot from 7 meters. No, you don't. You need to be LeBron James in order to do that. So I think that we need to think about what are the skills that are needed to be an orchestrator, and the answer is most firms won't be orchestrators. They don't have to be orchestrators. It's not even sensible to put money trying to be orchestrators, but they may want to be partners. I'll give you one example. WeChat, part of Tencent, one of the other tech firms that Amy was mentioning a moment ago, has got this system. It's this all-enveloping system. Think about WhatsApp meets Facebook meets Amazon, all bundled in one. And they have now a system for the Chinese tourists that are in Europe called WeChat Europe. So you have something on your phone is giving you information about where to eat, what to do, and you even have a SIM card that you don't have to pay roaming charges. Well, of course, WeChat can do that, but WeChat worked with KPN, the Dutch telco, and it said, who's going to work with me to create these webs of relationships, also provide the mobile bandwidth so that the system works. So I think that partners which are working under an orchestrator but have a significant authority in and of themselves have got a very interesting role to play. Or perhaps you don't want to be either an orchestrator or a partner, but you want to participate in other ecosystems. So it is choosing what is your role. There are different pros and cons. After you've chosen it, the question is, how do you implement it? And now we go to your second question, which is, how do organizations make sure that they do that stuff? The first answer is they can't expect their CEO to make all of these decisions, and they need to ensure that there is sufficient bottom-up energy that comes in. You can do a couple of things. You can do what Zhang Ruimin does, who says, I'm going to break up my firm, and because I know I need to embed myself in that, I'm going to do two things. The first thing is I'm going to have lots of different micro enterprises with their own profit and loss, with their own ability of getting funds, and ensuring that I will energize the people by the prospect of some of this upside and give them authority. The risk, of course, there is that you have very small entities. There's others that say, no, I want to have bigger groups that are doing this seeking of the collaborative relationships. Think about Ping An, which is the world's most valuable insurance firm. And if you look at what Ping An does, they are moving into new areas, they're building the ecosystem, but their CFO spends a disordinate amount of time looking at what are the KPIs and how to support the different units that are doing it. So choose what you do and don't assume you're going to be an orchestrator. Think about the pros and cons. Think about how you need to adjust your organization and make sure that you decentralize some of the decision making, but don't leave it to chance. Find a way of ensuring that you measure success and failure and that you are able to pull the plug. And the final problem is ecosystems you can see the result of it fairly quickly. So if you're a telco, you may be able to see whether your new ecosystem venture works within 3 months, 6 months, and the absolute latest. The problem with telcos is that they're used to plan with much longer time horizons. So you need to change your processes, you need to become more flexible and more responsive and not look inside for the politics, but start moving outside.
Could I add just two quick things on a practical note? My observation is that the leadership teams, and in particular the chief strategy officers, the chief risk officers, and some of the other executives who work on planning, tend to only look at the next couple of quarters. And for many organizations, their longer-term strategic planning cycles are either 3 years or 5 years out at the longest end, or teams will pick a random year in the future that ends in a 0 or a 5. Strategic plan 2030. You're laughing because you know I'm correct on this. The problem with that is that, again, these are sort of cognitive shortcuts. These are numbers that our brains understand. The challenge, of course, is that the future doesn't operate. There aren't research and development inflections and things on a normal timeline like that. So organizations, and again, I hear leaders all the time say, there's too much disruption, we can't possibly plan out for the longer term. The answer is that you can, but you have to be more flexible in your approach. So in the very short term, you can make tactical decisions and strategic decisions, but all of that should be done in service of your vision for the farther future and how you see your entire ecosystem evolving. Because if you are not simultaneously thinking near and long term at the same time, somebody else is going to define the ecosystem for you and drag your organization into the future. And at that point, you've lost any kind of strategic advantage. The second thing is organizations, I understand why, but especially in their risk departments, they want to measure the things that they know. Many organizations have developed their own formulas to measure certain KPIs and metrics. And all of those things tend to be the things over which they have complete control. And then a lot of leadership teams will say, well, why did this metric go positive and yet we're losing revenue, we're losing market share, our structure is falling apart, what's happening? What's happening is that you're not accounting for all of the other uncertain variables. Which is, again, a different way of thinking. So two things you can do is organize yourselves so that you do longer-term planning, even though we have a lot of uncertainty 10, 15, 20 years into the future. And the other thing that you can do is to change your metrics to incorporate more variables outside of the individual things within your organizations over which you have control.
Yep. So a lot of people want to hear more from CEO Zhang, and I think the question that I'd like to hear is as you have broken the company into these sort of into these ecosystems, what's been the most difficult part of the process, particularly with your employees, sort of trying to create this new business structure?
Model of operation, yeah.
Building an ecosystem, this is a very critical question when building an ecosystem. Previously, we had a hierarchical, bureaucratic organization, and there may be missing links when you give orders. Now that you are dividing it up into micro enterprises, would it be even more chaotic? What we did is to give powers entirely, completely back to the employees. CEOs had three powers: the decision-making power, the HR power, and the compensation setting power. Now that we have canceled our compensation department, each microenterprise are given these three powers. These three powers are back in the hands of microenterprises. So many companies come and learn from us. I would ask them the question, if you want to replicate our model, can you really give back those three powers to your people? And most people said no. Because in Taylorism, employees are seen as economic persons, but we want to have them become autonomous people. Like Immanuel Kant said, people are not a means to an end, but an end in themselves. So we need to have people work and create value with dignity. And their pay should not be set by others, but by how much value they can create. The extra value is shared by everyone. If they don't create any value, they'll have to leave. So how do we determine whether you can create value? We at Hire, microenterprises seek venture capital investments from the wider business community. If they can get such investment, they'll be able to grow faster. If they can't, they'll have to dissolve. So nobody is giving directions, but all of our microenterprises are actually working towards the same direction, which is to create value for the user. So Professor Jacobides has been asking me constantly, how do we help employees create an ecosystem? My answer is very simple. I think you need to help people understand what an ecosystem first. And I think there are two most important things. First, evolving together. And second, sharing value together. And what is evolving together? In traditional companies, you can't really evolve with others because you always want to be the best. We want to be the winner. Then we need to change that mindset. And secondly, how do we share value together? In traditional companies, it's all about maximizing shareholder value. And that leads to zero-sum game. So what we want to create is an ecosystem where all of the partners can share value created, and that will attract more partners to join this system so that it's constantly optimized. So the ultimate goal is not to create a walled garden where everything is manicured carefully, but those plants aren't really energetic or lively, but we want a rainforest where there could be deaths every day, but there are also perpetual life.
First of all, I love what you just said, because what that suggests to me is that we want to maximize stakeholder value, not shareholder value. Many people in the company create value, and they should get utility out of that, and particularly they should be able to increase wealth as a result of their contributions. I wanted to suggest to you also that in terms of how companies decide which direction to go, customers have a lot to do with that. If you make products and services that customers have decided to abandon, that message should be pretty clear fairly quickly. I will say that with regard to commonality and interoperability, it didn't take long for the consumers of proprietary networking technology in the network space to abandon proprietary SNA or DECnet and the other things and adopt something that would allow them to use multiple brands of computers in the same network. So that message came across very, very quickly. And the final point, I think, is that in terms of the ability of a company to adapt to conditions, there's this wonderful expression: if someone is going to eat your lunch, it might as well be you. And so if you have to, you should cannibalize your own products and services before somebody else does.
Yeah. So I mean, I think people appreciated, Mr. Zhang's description of empowering people instead of sort of obliterating people. But a lot of the questions that have come in, I would say, reflect where we are in the world now, which is fear of big technology and fear that technology is going to dehumanize, will create value of some sort, but at the expense of humanity. You're the chief
Internet evangelist.
Evangelist, which probably sounded good at one point.
Wait a minute. I still think it sounds good.
Okay. But help address this, because I really think a lot of people are feeling, and Amy, you addressed some of this, that this stuff sort of happens, and then years later we realize, whoops, we didn't really anticipate everything that we were going to see.
Well, it's pretty plain that we didn't anticipate the kind of bad human behavior that we're seeing that drives some of the negative things that are visible in the internet today. The social media, misinformation, disinformation. By the way, that's why we read Shakespeare. Even though those plays were written 400 years ago, he lays out all of the weaknesses and bad behaviors that humans are capable of, and we're seeing that bubble up, especially in the social media. The solution to that problem is not going to be purely technical. It is going to have to be about social behavior and what incentives there are for people to abuse the technologies that are available. So it seems to me that if we're going to steer our way out of the current situation, it's going to be based on understanding what human motivations are and to create new incentives for different behaviors.
Incentives are key here because, again, there's systems level change afoot. Google announced a new checking account system in the United States. Hasn't been implemented yet, but Apple is in the credit card business along with Goldman Sachs. Amazon has its own payment system. Alibaba, Tencent, everybody's got payment systems.
Libra.
And what's interesting is, for many of these, the normal way that a financial services company would make revenue is on interest or on fees based per transaction. However, in these cases, the fee structure is not based around that, which tells us something about the future of the value of money and currency and markets and our financial systems, because what we see is that the data generated is more valuable than the transaction itself. We've never been in a point in our history, our evolutionary history, where something like that so fundamentally challenges our current way of operating, the operating system of everyday life, has occurred. And so we have to figure out better ways to incentivize organizations to think through the longer term implications. As I always say, failing to plan is planning to fail. And I work with data for a living. My whole life is about building risk models and opportunity models. I don't see a lot of that happening, and I don't think that we are going to change our behaviors on our own, and I don't think the organizations that power the operating systems of life similarly will change. We have to develop incentives to get people to the table to collaborate for what's in the best interest of humanity going forward.
Can I ask you a question on that?
Sure.
I think that's really interesting. And if we look at how something like the ubiquity of simulations is coming up based on AI, based on multi-agent artificial intelligence, I'm wondering how this will impact the challenges you were just addressing. Because if you could simulate the outbreak of Ebola, if you could simulate the future behavior of a whole city based on data, if you could even simulate the future of a country like China, which the experts are trying to do, and they're successful at it in several steps. How do you think this will interrelate to what you're just pointing out?
Yeah, and so some of that modeling is already happening. The challenge, of course, is what data are you using to build the models? Bad data in usually means bad data on the other side, bad data out. And so, a lot of my field, I'm a quantitative futurist. My field, the modern version of it, was born in the post-military industrial complex. And a lot of the simulations that were built had to do with the launch of a nuclear weapon and what might happen afterward. We're talking about complex systems of life now. And the math doesn't work. There are too many possible permutations and too many variables. So simulations are useful, but going back to what Vint says and what Vint champions, I think, in his everyday life, we have to put people in the center of all of this. If we are not building people-centered systems, then really nothing else matters.
Michael.
So if I could just separate two very different issues. One of the issues which we are discussing is the issue of regulation and the way that we should approach it. And that has to do with our inability so far, and I'm returning back to that, of the traditional apparatus that people in antitrust areas still have in understanding how we can measure and assess power in the context of ecosystems. And we are in urgent need of doing that. Just think, for instance, about what we're seeing with valuations in firms like Uber, that is losing billions of dollars, but we still think that it is worth to have a negative and big multiple because we think it's going to be super profitable. Why? Is there any chance Uber is going to be profitable? From what we know from the behavior of customers in ride sharing, the answer is no, because they are super responsive to price reduction. So what is the implicit assumption on this valuation? That once you get big enough, you're going to have such network externalities and such a hold on the consumers that you are going to squeeze them like hell, and all the money that you have lost will be more than made up. So the investors are betting on a very unfair world. I hope that that is not quite right, but that partly depends on our ability to fix regulation. It's also partly because not all markets have network externalities, some do, others don't. The second problem that we've discussed, and it's an exciting management problem, and one that I hope that we'll continue discussing in this conference, is the managerial issue. Whether we like it or not, we do live in a world where things will be structured via ecosystems. We have to figure out what our role is. We have to empower people within the organization to come up with the ideas that are going to be valuable and to find a mechanism of sorting it out. We heard one example from Zhang, Ruimin. We need to think about others that will complement, enhance, qualify, expand. So there is a great managerial challenge, which whatever we do with regulation, and it is important, is still with us. And I hope that that's what we're going to be spending the next day and a half speaking about.
Yep. So that, I think, is going to be about the final word. This is an amazing panel. I mean, for me, I just sort of sat back and let you guys go, and that's exactly what you want. It was interesting to kind of sense the reaction. There seemed to be interest and excitement on the one hand, a system that would work so well would find your lost sock, to also excitement about Miriam's challenge to the Internet of Everything, which maybe we can call the Internet of Nothing, which also seemed like a really good idea as well. So anyway, please join me in thanking this amazing panel, and it's been great to start this
Wow.
day off.
Good job.
You're amazing.
Good job.